Hello, class. This is part 2 of week 2. We'll be discussing deontology right now, deontological ethical theory. So, deontology basically holds that the basis of morality is doing our duty, doing what is right for its own sake, just because it's right. That forms the basis of morality. We're not concerned about the consequences of the action. It's most important that we do what is right for its own sake. Our ethical philosopher that we have that contributed most to deontology that we'll be studying in depth in with this excerpt that we have in our book is Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher. He said that we should do our duty purely out of goodwill. And what does that mean? What does goodwill mean? Goodwill means a will that always acts from a sense of duty and reverence for moral law, without regards for consequences or immediate inclinations, no matter what we want to do or we think we should do, or the consequences that may result. We must do our duty, and we must do our duty through goodwill. So for Immanuel Kant, the development of goodwill and proper self-esteem is really the only way that we're going to be able to ensure that we consistently do our duty despite whatever external pressures we may experience, whatever we feel, our emotions, etc. So it's very rationally based. If under Kant's deontological theory, if there's a universal moral law, and if it is to be morally binding, it must be based on reason. Reason provides the foundation for morality. And here's how he articulates that, which we will see in our excerpt. He formulated what was called the categorical imperative, and it has two parts to it. The first part of Kant's categorical imperative was that we should act only on that maxim being a brief statement expressing a general truth or rule of conduct. Act only on that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So basically the universality of the law is what's important. So the idea that if murder is wrong, it ought to be wrong in all circumstances. So it's a very absolute universal moral theory, Kantian deontology, we'll see. So the second part of Kant's categorical imperative is that which states that so act as to treat humanity, whether in thine own person or that in any other, in every case as an end in itself, never as a means only. We should never use ourselves, any other person, as a means to an end. People are ends in themselves. And what does that mean? What that means is we cannot use people to reach a certain goal or a certain end. So with regard to a goal that we want, an ultimate good for society, we should always respect people's autonomy, integrity, respect their dignity as individual human beings. So that's basically what that means, and it goes a little bit more further in the book about it. So the categorical imperative, according to Immanuel Kant, it really provides a framework for deriving moral duties or maxims that can be applied in specific situations. And it's very universal. So these moral maxims or duties have to apply to everyone and under all circumstances. For example, if it's wrong to lie, then it's always wrong to lie, regardless of the circumstances. This is an absolutism part of deontology that Kant had, that according to Kant's theory was formulated. So we have another deontological philosopher that this book talks about, this chapter talks about, was W.D. Ross. He said that he had a problem with the absolutism of Kant's theory. He had offered that there are actually some duties that may be morally more important at certain times. He called these prima facie duties. Prima facie meaning at first sight they're accepted as factual or true until otherwise disproved. So prima facie duties generally mean that these are moral duties that may on occasion be overridden by stronger moral claims. For W.D. Ross, he argued against absolutism in Kantian deontology. He said that moral duties cannot be absolute because there are situations in which they come into conflict. And he believed, to some extent, that consequences do matter when applying moral principles. So he was much less absolute than Kant was. So we have several prima facie duties, and if you remember our uh, ethical principles, some of these are very similar. Some of these are the same. We have seven prima facie duties that W.D. Ross had identified. First one is non-maleficence. If you recall, that means to do no harm. Beneficence, meaning do good acts and increase happiness. Fidelity, exercising our commitment based on past commitments and promises. Gratitude, being thankful for gifts received, when we receive gifts or unearned favors and services from others. Another one is reparation. We have a duty to make up for past harms caused. Another duty is self-improvement. It is our duty to improve our moral knowledge and virtue. The last prima facie duty he had was justice, which is to give each person equal consideration. When we talk about justice, there's two different kinds of justice that our book identifies. One is when we think about crime and punishment, we think about retributive justice. This is justice that is punishment for wrongdoing in proportion to the magnitude of the crime. It must be proportioned to the magnitude of the crime. We'll discuss that when we talk about the death penalty. This idea of retributive justice. Another facet of justice is called distributive justice, wherein in distributive justice, according to that, we give fair distribution of benefits and burdens in a society. It requires impartiality. One ethical philosopher from whom we don't have an excerpt from this book anymore. In prior editions, we did, but Judith Boss had excerpted part of John Rawls' A Theory of Justice, and John Rawls is mentioned in this introductory section in Chapter 1. With regard to distributive justice. He wrote this book. It was published in 1971 called A Theory of Justice. And for him, justice required not only impartially acting towards people, like from a utilitarian perspective, but also treating people fairly in an proportion to their needs and merits. This is very important, to their needs and merits. So he advocated a change in social systems so that justices that were created are not occurring in the first place. We could look at some of our social systems and see how inequality and injustices are created. And he advocated changing this so that these injustices do not occur in the first place. So under Rawls, he envisions a society, a happy society based on his social contract that he proposes. It starts off this way. It's to base justice on an unbiased and impartial social contract so we all be treated justly. He asks us to use a conceptual tool called a veil of ignorance. Now, it's asks you to imagine that you are ignorant of the advantages and disadvantages that you receive in life through the natural lottery, through the family in which you were born, through your wealth, power, prestige, etc. Like all that, you are ignorant to all the advantages and disadvantages that you may have in life. Once we're on the same playing field and everyone is experiencing this, according to Rawls, all rational people would then agree on the following two principles of justice. And here they are. The first rule of justice, a principle of justice, would be that each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty comparable with a similar liberty for others. So basically liberty would be the most important part of this of justice. We all are treated and afforded liberty in our actions and our dealings. And the second part of this is that social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that both are A, reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage, and B, attached to positions and offices open to all. The second part of this is a little bit easier. Basically, it talks about equity of opportunity. So if you think about social systems and when there's barriers to access to education, employment, political office, things like that, these would be eradicated. The first one is the reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage is called the difference principle in other areas. You'll see it analyzed as the difference principle, wherein to the extent that there is inequality and injustice, it should be arranged so that it benefits even the least worse off, right, or the worse off. So that way, because he was under not really any a misunderstanding that we could completely eradicate inequality and injustice, but to the extent that it does remain, it should still be beneficial to the least best off. So that is the Rawlsian social contract. So definitely study that because that is going to be important, even though we don't have an excerpt from him in our book that you will read. So, strengths and limitations of deontology. When there is a moral dilemma, sometimes Kantian deontology with its absolutes and this idea that there's no conflict between moral rules. When there is a moral dilemma, sometimes we do not really have guidance on what the right way to go is. So, there's that. This deontology may also sacrifice community in the name of individual autonomy. It sometimes ignores that we are part of a larger social network of relationships that constrain or privilege us. So sometimes we need to also look at our community, those around us that are effective, instead of acting solely on goodwill, solely on what is right for right's sake. That may be a moral consideration for us as well. With regard to deontology, it sometimes neglects to take into account the role of sentiment and care and morality, which we'll talk about next week with regard to care ethics. Deontology, most importantly, particularly Kantian deontology, downplays the importance of consequences. It ignores it under Kantian deontology and is not as important other ways. So what is important is that we do our duty out of goodwill, purely out of goodwill. That is the only thing that's binding to us. So that is it for deontology. That is it for week 2. Happy reading. All of our readings this week are in our book, textbook. There's nothing online for you to read, and then you'll do your assignment. And if you have any questions, comments, clarifications needed, please let me know. Thank you very much, and have a happy week.